Today, we are continuing on in our message series in the book of Matthew, and we're getting right towards the end of the second part of that series. Next week, we'll actually start the second major message or sermon that Jesus gives in the book of Matthew, and each of those messages, there's 4 in total in the book of Matthew, kind of divvy out the book as a whole. And so it'd be exciting to get into that. As a reminder, we had Jesus who had crossed over the Sea of Galilee. There'd been a storm on it. He had cast demons out of a gentleman on that side, and Jesus had calmed the storm and come back, and after freeing those demon-possessed men. And here a few weeks ago, I know it's been a couple weeks with Faith Promise last week, but we got to read in the first part of Matthew chapter 9. We read the first half of it, and we saw how Jesus healed a leper and forgave his sins, which was a significant thing. That started a debate with the Pharisees. And we also saw, excuse me, should have hydrated better apparently. We also saw some of John the Baptist's disciples. It's bad enough I cough one time and I think you're all going to think I have COVID. I get a frog in my throat and yeah, now you're all going to think you're going to die here. So it's a good thing you know Jesus, but I don't think you have an issue. Excuse me. All right, so several of John the Baptist's disciples came to Jesus and were critiquing him because they were very hyperactive and fasting, which is a good spiritual discipline, but in doing that, they really thought Jesus and his disciples should be just as intense about it. And Jesus pointed out to them, you know, I'm coming and I'm bringing in a new covenant. And so while the bridegroom is here, basically while the bride of the church is here on earth for these few short years of human history, it's really important that that be celebrated and that be recognized. And he uses that as a metaphor and basically says, would it be right at a wedding for somebody to invite all their guests in and then say like, oh, and you get to fast in celebration of the wedding? Not a very celebratory thing. And Jesus, this will be relevant to our passage today, finishes that discourse by talking about, in effect, the old and new covenant and talking about how you can't take this old system of the law and just sort of patch the grace that Jesus gives into that. You can't just meld these two things together. One leads to the other, and one's the logical end of the other. But he uses the metaphor of wineskins being used a second time to ferment things, or an unshrunk patch being sewn onto a normal garment that's already been laundered, and how that will cause it to tear, and really talks about how there's this different worldview of two different systems that are kind of coming together. And with Jesus' coming, a new covenant comes. We can't try to infer all the old stuff onto the new. So we'll be in the second part of Matthew chapter 9. We'll start at verse 18 today. Before we do that, though, I just wanted to share with you a brief story from our house. I think it's always interesting as a parent. You never know, kid to kid, they're all different. And of course, we have 5 kids, so there's a lot of difference going on there. And you always try to draw the similarities and differences. But I would say, of our sons, certainly Marlo is the boldest. He's the one who is always ready to rush headlong into things, and often without thinking too terribly long about it. We don't want to trifle ourselves with that. Hudson is much more reserved, and if there are new things, he's very uncomfortable with that. And in our new house that we just moved into, we have a shower, but we don't have a bath. So that's been interesting for the kids, and we tried to kind of get them ready for that in the old house as we got into it. But yesterday, Annabelle was working with Hudson, and the last few times he's been in there, he has just been bawling because he is terrified of this shower head, and this is going to kill him for sure, and he is just utterly terrified. And so he was in there sobbing, and I could tell Annabelle was getting frustrated. So I went in there and I played the dad role and told him, "Hey, calm down, kid." And we started talking it through with him, and I coaxed him into getting and stretching out his hand into the water. And the funny part is, Marlo's having the best time of his life in there. He's literally in there just dancing around under the shower head, having a blast. And Hudson, while Marlo's doing that, is reaching out like, I'm pretty sure my hand's going to melt off. Let's see. Oh, and then he drew it back, and he gave a little giggle like, oh, whoa. And so he reached out a second time. I'm like, no, see if you got your hand, dude, but can you get your arm in there? Can you get your whole arm, do you think? And he gets the edge of his arm up there, and just, and he's laughing. And so finally I work it up to a point. And, again, Marlo's dancing. I'm telling Hudson, Marlo's dancing in it. You ought to go dance under there like Marlo. And so he goes in there and he just sort of gets the edge of himself under there, and he's trying to dance around, and he comes out and he is laughing as hysterically as I've ever seen him do it. It was like he had stared death in the face and come out clean. It was I think that same sort of laugh you'd have if you just, you went skydiving or bungee jumping or something like that, and you're like, oh my gosh, I survived that. But But it is interesting to see, isn't it? And different kids approach things differently. And I think sometimes in our Christian walks, that's kind of the way faith is, isn't it? I mean, there may be some things you're called to do in your life that you don't think twice about. And yet somebody else is asked to do it and they think, well, that doesn't sound smart at all. That could be dangerous. Are you sure? And the opposite's true. Some of you have probably seen somebody who just boldly goes forward and does what Jesus says. Andrew and Yolanda here last week with their mission. That's a good example. Boy, they're putting everything on the line, going into an unstable country. They just run into it. And it makes you think like, man, I'm sometimes scared to talk to friends about Jesus. How is it they can go across the world and do it? But, God works through that with each of us. And today we're going to talk about this element of faith and what it is and a big aspect of what it means for God's kingdom. And we're really going to see that expressed through some supernatural healings and miracles that Jesus does. But I want to point out to you with this that on the surface, the obvious thing that we're showing here is that Jesus has this miraculous power, that he can do what no one before could do. He can go and cast out demons and disease. And yet, at the end of our passage, Jesus is going to apply his own actions. And the application, it would seem, is not going to be necessarily about supernatural healing, but about something else. So let's go ahead and take a moment here. We'll pray and then dive into our passage. We're in chapter 9, verses 18 through 38, and we'll start with verses 18 through 26. Before we begin that, if you would please join me. Let's just take a moment and come before the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity to study your word. Lord, we're not perfect, but it is. And we know that you can use it to move in our hearts, to challenge us to grow, and to draw us to be bolder and stronger through the power of your Spirit and in your name. Father, I pray you would be at work in that way today, guiding our steps, guiding our hearts and minds, and leading us into your presence. We pray these things in Jesus Christ's name and merit, Lord. Amen. All right. Chapter 9, verse 18. While he was saying this, a synagogue leader came and knelt before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her, and she will live." Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. Just then, a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. She said to herself, "If only I could touch his cloak, I will be healed." Jesus turned when he saw her. "Take heart, daughter," he said. "Your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed at that moment. When Jesus entered the synagogue leader's house and saw the noisy crowd of people playing pipes, he said, "Go away. The girl is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took the girl by the hand. And she got up. News of this spread all throughout the region. All right, now as usual, as we talk about Matthew's gospel, I'm going to incorporate some facts that come out of other gospels like Luke and Mark that wrote about this same story. And I just think that'll help bring it to life even a little more for us. But Matthew is retelling us, the author of this book, under the Holy Spirit's inspiration, who in the last chapter we actually saw come to be a disciple of Jesus. Now here he is telling us this story. And Matthew shares that after this altercation with John's disciples, and even some of the Pharisees we read in the other Gospels were involved in that, being accused of not fasting enough. Just in the midst of that, we have Jairus, who's a local synagogue leader, so in effect, a local church leader, who comes up to Jesus. And in the other Gospels, we hear his daughter isn't dead yet, but she has been severely ailing. At this point, Jesus has been in the area about 24 hours, and so we can imagine perhaps Jairus has been vacillating a little bit. You might think, why didn't he just immediately go to Jesus if his daughter is sick? And that's probably because as a religious leader, there was already becoming a lot of pressure on Jewish religious leaders not to follow Jesus. A lot of the top upper people in Jewish leadership were wanting to insulate and protect their position of power, and the idea of this new Messiah guy coming around and turning things on their head did not seem very comfortable. We had to keep the status quo, and we'll see more of that ideology as we go. But But in the other Gospels, we understand the man's name is Jairus. Now, it's interesting because we don't see a lot of other material about Jairus, but the implication is that as the other Gospel authors mention him by name, he must have been in the church around the time that the Gospel was written. People would have known who he was, as if I were to mention one of your names here. People in the church would be like, oh, yeah, that person. And so apparently Jairus was a common name. Jairus at the time, we're told, had a 12-year-old daughter. And for him being such a powerful person, being a leader in the local synagogue, one of the most revered members of the community, Jairus is at a humbled point. He has one and only one child. It's a 12-year-old daughter. Incidentally, in the Hebrew world, that was around the age where you assumed adulthood, where you would have officially become a woman. And so they have poured into this kid. Now, mind you, there's no birth control. So if for 12 years they only had one kid, that means either there's some relational issues or more likely they have not been able to have anymore. And so this is the one child they have, and it must be very precious to them. And you can imagine the agony that Jairus must be going through as he's dealing with this. And out of fear and concern for his daughter, he travels to Jesus. He comes in, and Jairus does not mince any words about this. We're told he literally falls down on his knees in front of Jesus, begging to him, and says, Lord, my daughter is sick, but if you come, I know you can make her better. And Jesus, to his credit, without hesitation, gets up, walks out of the place he's in, and starts down the street. Now, interestingly, in the other Gospels, we read of this trip along the street, that as Jesus was traveling, and the crowds were gathering around him and actually smashing him, in effect, coming and pushing up against him, and it was difficult to even maneuver through the group. In fact, the word in the Greek used here to describe how the crowds were interacting around Jesus is the same word used in the parable of the sower when it talks about the weeds choking out the good seed that was around it. And so you can imagine this is a mess. And no doubt there's a good reason, because Jesus has been around here healing person after person. He's preached the Sermon on the Mount, one of his most famous sermons, and people everywhere are talking about this guy, about what he can do. And so they travel down the road. They're being pressed on from all sides. And in the midst of that, a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years, interesting yet again, we see that number 12 being used here. For 12 years, she's been bleeding, and most scholars from the Greek presume this is a gynecological bleed, if you follow me, comes up and sees Jesus and believes, if only I could touch his robe. If I could just do that, then I would be healed. Now, some interesting things to note about somebody who has that issue would be that anybody who has a perpetual bleeding issue that has that exposure to blood is in Jewish society considered ceremonially unclean. And so they would not be allowed into the common realms of society. They would be castigated a lot like the leper on the outskirts of society. And that's been going on for this lady for 12 years. Now, as a reminder, this region of Galilee that Jesus is in, Capernaum, it has around a 2,000 person population. Around 2,500 people is what they estimate. So pretty close to Myrtle Point. If you had somebody in the city of Myrtle Point that nobody was allowed to get within 10 feet of, would everybody know who that person was? Yes. And yet, despite that, this woman in desperation is pushing through the crowd. And if the crowd is that intense, she must really have to elbow people aside to try to get there. But she's desperate because in her mind, the only way she could ever get back to being a part of society again is to go there and simply just touch the robe of Jesus. Now, this idea of touching Jesus' robe actually has some Greek mythology roots. There was, in Greek society, the idea that if there was somebody who was a magician or a healer, that a lot of his power actually rested in his clothing. And sort of that same idea as Merlin's robe or something like that these things people wear give them magical powers. Now, that's not the case at all. And yet, despite her skewed worldview, her faith is actually still rewarded. She goes, she chases after Jesus. And in the other Gospels, we read that when she touches Jesus' cloak, he stops because he sensed power leaving him and asks, who was it who touched my robe? And eventually, the woman comes forward and admits it was her. And Jesus asks, well, did you think this would heal you? And she says, yes. And he says, well, then your faith has made you healed. Now, scholars have some arguments about this interaction that happens. Is it that Jesus didn't actually know who the woman was? Or was it that he was using this simply as an opportunity? And I'll say, actually, both are true in a sense. So I think there's a good argument for either. It could be that Jesus is trying to use this as an opportunity to show people, you guys remember this lady over here who I should have to go into lockdown because I should now be ceremonially unclean because she touched me? Yeah, that's not a problem anymore. That's gone. She's healed. 12 years of her being in isolation, and she's renewed. So Jesus can show that and highlight it. That could be the case. It also could be that God the Father decided that that power would leave Jesus, and that Jesus sensed that, and then when actually looking, he asked his disciples the question. So I think either is a valid argument. But nonetheless, we see Jesus heal this woman on the way to Jairus' house. Now, in the other Gospels, we hear after this that one of Jairus' servants come and rush up to him and basically come to him and say, hey, boss, I'm sorry, but you may as well tell Jesus to head back to where he came from. Your daughter's already dead. And Jesus turns to Jairus and says, she'll be fine, let's go, basically. And so they head off on this journey. When they get to the house, we hear about all these people gathered around. And it's good to know in the ancient world a few things. First of all, that'll help give us context. We've mentioned this before. In the ancient world, burials weren't conducted a week or 2 weeks after somebody died. There wasn't the embalming processes or anything like that. It would be a mess if you waited that long. So typically the day of, if somebody died at midnight, well, then it'd be, or at 11 p.m., then it'd be the next day. But generally speaking, if somebody passes away on a day, then that suddenly becomes the funeral day. There wasn't a lot of debate around it. So the fact that there's already people here gathered around is telling, particularly because typically in the ancient world, if somebody died, you were expected to hire some professional flute players or mourners to come. Even the impoverished were expected to do this as a standard practice. Bring in those people in order to mourn and show everybody in the city, like we all need to gather together around this person. This person's broken right now, and there's a loss that has happened. So in Jairus' case, that walk, we don't know exactly where he lived or, was he in the country or what. Apparently it was far enough that it took them a while to get there. No doubt the crowd crushing them as they went didn't make it easy. But also, there was already time to go out and hire the professional mourners and for them to come back and begin the process of professionally mourning before Jesus ever arrived. Between that and the servant who wouldn't have come to Jesus had he only been 2 minutes away and said that, we know apparently this is a fair amount of distance that they're covering, in which case Jairus' daughter has been dead for quite some time. This didn't just happen 2 minutes ago. Now, in the other Gospels, we read Jesus comes and he actually allows Peter, James, and John, along with Jairus and his wife, to come into the house. They send out the professional mourners, and Jesus walks in there, takes the young girl's hand. She gets up, and Jesus says to them, to the crowd, of course, as he goes in, she's just asleep, and they laugh at him. There's an interesting thing in that for Jesus, somebody who's asleep and somebody who's dead, apparently there's not a whole lot of difference in getting them up from that. That's pretty significant. Now, we know from the Gospels she is in fact dead, but this is really a reference to Jesus' power here. He also goes in, and interestingly, we hear in the other Gospels that when he heals the daughter, he says to Jairus and his wife, feed her, when she's a teenager, so I guess that goes without saying. But also, he says, don't tell people about this. Now, that seems a little bit strange, because you think, well, how would people not know about this? They already started a funeral, and she's going to be walking around in 10 minutes. People might see that and put two and two together here. But really, I think what Jesus means is what's happened here in this room, what I just did, don't go into all the details of that. And part of the motive for that has to be the same reason Jesus is frequently telling other people, don't tell people what's happened here, which is people hearing about Jesus' miracles is the exact reason he can't even walk from one house to another without nearly being smashed by a mob. Right now, he's wanting to teach people, and he is going to heal people as he does that. He's going to do these miracles to affirm who he is, the Messiah, God's Son here on earth. But he also needs the freedom to move around, and all of these people hounding him is not going to help with that. So we see that. We see a miracle here. Interestingly, in this story, there are two people that would have technically made Jesus ceremonially unclean to touch. A dead body, the young girl, that is to say, and the woman who had the bleeding issue. So both of those things would have, and yet Jesus heals both of them. And so at that point, he can kind of say, yeah, I don't actually have to observe that. They were better when I got to them. That fixed it. But fascinating what Jesus does here. Okay, let's continue on with verses 27 through 31. We've got 4 sections total here. As Jesus went from there, 2 blind men followed him, calling out, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." When he had gone indoors, the blind men came to him, and he asked them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" "Yes, Lord," they replied. Then he touched their eyes and said, "According to your faith, let it be done to you." And their sight was restored. Jesus warned them sternly, "See that no one knows about this." But they went out and spread the news about him all over that region. People are not very good at listening to Jesus with this stuff, are they? You know, you'd think simple instruction. I want to just note, I'm kind of starting at the end here, but when he says to them firmly, "See it to it that nobody knows about this, that nobody hears about this," it's interesting because in the Greek, that sort of verbiage, the language used there, is the kind of language you might even use if you were threatening violence. It was very strongly stated by Jesus. Now, I don't think Jesus was threatening them with violence, but it just shows how adamant he was. He was really like shaking them by the shoulders. Do not tell anyone. But they didn't listen very well. So to go back to the beginning of that section, though, Jesus he's left that house. He's began his journey again. The crowds are gathered around him again, and there are 2 blind men who must be friends, and they have heard about Jesus. We don't know where they've come from, how far they've traveled, but they're looking for him now. Now, would it be easy in a town like this, well, let's just say in a giant crowd, if you were trying to find one person, sort of that "where's Waldo" problem, how easy is that? Pretty hard, right? I always found that book frustrating. I could never find Waldo. It was terrible. So I would imagine if, even with my eyesight, I'd have a similar problem with Jesus. I mean, you could kind of look at where the crowds were flowing. But to add to that, if you were blind, you were absolutely without vision, imagine the difficulties you would face. These 2 men are desperately trying to come and to find Jesus. And in the midst of it, almost as if they're hoping we can just do some sonar here and "Save us, Son of David." You know, they're yelling it out, hoping that he'll hear. And that "Son of David" title, incidentally, that's a messianic reference. So they're acknowledging Jesus' messianic placement. And yeah, they're hollering for him, but they're going through this crowd. And I have to imagine as they were doing this, they must have had to stop several times and, grab somebody with the shoulder and, "Excuse me, sir or ma'am, where is Jesus? Can you I'd say point, but how about you just point my body that way and I'll go that way." And they have to be just feeling their way through, trying to find it. Already this crowd is so violent, it's pressing in, and they're having a hard time. But these 2 persist so much, and they ask enough people for advice that eventually they find the house that Jesus is in. Again, I think Jesus waits till they're inside the house, in part because his goal here isn't to showboat with miracles. He is showing who he is through that, but he's going to have some discretion here. So the people come into the house, and Jesus asks them a frank question. "Do you actually believe that I can heal you?" And without hesitation, they say, "Yes, we do." And Jesus goes to them and immediately heals them of their blindness. These 2 men who were incapable of seeing before, their eyes are open, perhaps for the first time. We don't know how long they've been blind. But again, in a smaller community, the 2 blind guys who pal around together, you'd probably recognize them, right? And when they suddenly weren't blind, that would be something of note. So here, Jesus again does this miracle. But an interesting element I want to point out in both of these accounts are, with many of these people, they're reliant on somebody else to lead them towards Jesus. They're having to look to someone else to get help to get there. And we'll tie into that in the end. But here again, Jesus shows his divine power, demonstrates his qualifications as the Messiah. We'll now read verses 32 through 34. We'll see a last miracle, and then we'll hear how Jesus applies a lot of this. And the application will work towards this chapter and look toward the chapter ahead. So, verse 32 through 34. While they were going out, a man who was demon-possessed and could not talk was brought to Jesus. And when the demon was driven out, the man who had been mute spoke. The crowd was amazed and said, "Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel." But the Pharisees said, "It is by the prince of demons that he drives out demons." Okay, so Jesus is left now. He's just healed these 2 blind men, and he heads off. And they bring to him a local man who is mute or dumb, common words being used. But in the Greek, the words can actually refer, and often do refer, to both not only a loss of the capability to speak, but it can also reference a lack of hearing. And as you might imagine, in a pre-sign language era especially, you losing your ability to hear would probably result in you losing your ability to speak. It would be very difficult to develop that ability if you couldn't hear at all. So in the case of this gentleman, prior to being possessed, this is an attribute he's had before, he actually was incapable of doing either. And yet, these other people grab him, and we don't know how much he's squirming or fighting, how nervous he is, but they drag him up and bring him to Jesus, again, pressing through this crowd to bring this guy forward. And Jesus sees him, casts the demons right out of him, as if it was the casualest of things. And afterwards, not only are the demons gone, but a man who could never speak before is suddenly able to, suddenly gains that ability. If you saw that happen in Myrtle Point to somebody you knew in this community, would you recognize it? That'd be pretty incredible, right? Again, our populations are similar. And so here is another miracle, and Jesus does this thing. And the crowds respond after seeing all of these things, seeing a young girl raised from the dead, seeing a woman with a bleeding issue that just goes away. She's had it for 12 years, but it's gone now. And men who've lost their sight, who suddenly regain it. A demon-possessed man who not only has the demon cast out, but now on top of that, as if that wasn't enough, can actually speak and hear again where he couldn't before. And they say something quite understandable. Never in Israel has something like this happened. This is crazy. There's something absolutely incredible occurring here. But notice what the religious leaders say. Again, we see sort of what that counter pressure was to Jairus. The Pharisees, these religious experts, they're there. They look and they say, oh, you guys think he's impressive, but he's just casting out demons because he works for the devil. He's just using the devil's power to do it. Now, in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus will actually address this complaint. If you're wondering if there's any sensibility to that, especially as an unbeliever, perhaps that question comes up, just to point it out. Jesus' argument later, understandably, is going to be, house divided against itself can't stand. If I'm working for the devil, then why am I destroying his kingdom here on earth? How does that really work out, It might be in covert ops or something like that, then you might feign something like that. But Jesus is systematically going and unraveling all kinds of destructive forces that the devil's had in place. And it's hard to imagine that the devil would be especially happy about that. That that's the way his world works, that this would be functional. So, of course, there's no validity to the claim. But for these guys, that's the best they can do. They can't say, oh, well, she wasn't really dead, because everybody outside of the house was mocking Jesus before he ever went in. And they can't say, those guys are just pretending to be blind, because everybody in town knew those guys beforehand, and we all knew they were blind. And that lady that you couldn't be within 10 feet of, you knew she was sick too. So there's no way that you're going to convince these people it's all a hoax. None of this is real. They know it is. You wouldn't pretend for 12 years to be, in the woman's case, for example, you wouldn't pretend for 12 years to have a medical issue when you didn't, especially if it made you isolated from everybody in society. Instead, Jesus is actually healing all that. He's addressing all of it, and he's bringing new life to these people. Now, what comes next, I think, is quite interesting. It almost seems like it doesn't fit the passage, and yet when we look back, I think you'll see that it does. So let's finish out with verses 35 through 38, the last three verses. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Now, we hear, in effect, at the end, that all this stuff we just read is a summarization of many things that are happening, that Jesus had a lengthy time of ministry here, and that he did a lot more than Matthew actually recounts. So he's just touching the surface, giving us some of the highlights. But nonetheless, we see Jesus goes through, he's doing all these miracles, and in the midst of that, he is continuing to preach about the kingdom, and he talks to his disciples and says that he feels bad for all the people of Israel. Notice he isn't feeling bad for them because of all the medical issues. And that's a good reason to. I mean, it's natural that we sympathize with people who are going through tough things like that. But I find it intriguing that for Jesus' part, he feels bad for them because spiritually, whatever their medical conditions are. Spiritually, they're like sheep without a shepherd. Now, that idea of being sheep without a shepherd, it relates a lot back to Psalm 23, and about a year ago, we had a message on that. If you want to go on our YouTube channel and look back at it, that might give you more details. But just to give you the idea, a shepherd had a lot of responsibilities for a sheep, and we don't have a whole lot of shepherds nowadays. But at least in America, we don't. But to get you the idea, a shepherd was responsible for protecting his flock. He was responsible to guide them to the fertile grounds around the countryside where there would actually be grass. If he took them to the wrong place, they could all starve to death. He had to protect them from pestilence, from disease, and had to keep them from eating noxious weeds. There were a litany of different responsibilities that a shepherd had. And if you had a bad, lazy shepherd, like, say, a Pharisee in this case, they'd be focused on themselves and not really on you. And as a result, you'd end up with a flock that just had a lot of hurt, broken people who were lost. A sheep would wander off, the shepherd wouldn't go find it. They'd just say, well, 99 is as good as 100. Fair enough. And that's the kind of leadership that's been present. Those same Pharisees who are impugning Jesus could be out there expanding God's kingdom, could be out there declaring the good news that the Messiah is here. Not that the Messiah is going to come or will come, but that he's here right now. And what God has planned for thousands of years is about to come to fruition. But it is interesting that for Jesus, he talks about the harvest is plentiful. The people here that can be brought into God's kingdom are plentiful, but the workers are few. Now, interestingly, in chapter 10, we're going to read a discourse, a sermon with instructions that Jesus gives to his disciples as he sends them out for this very purpose. But it's interesting, in this moment, Jesus asked them to pray that God would raise up leaders to go out and share what his kingdom is. They pray that, and in no time they're out doing it. That should be part of the universal Christian experience. We should all be praying about that. And then we should be alarmed to find out that in Matthew 28, at the end of this whole book, Jesus says, yeah, you got to go do that. But that's part of our job. And what's intriguing is these miracles happened and they affirm Jesus' deity. But in Jesus' mind, the real application is not necessarily that. He's actually looking at the spiritual lostness that's going on and telling his disciples, that's the thing we need to address. And so I think the application is twofold as we read this passage. First, if you don't know or have a relationship with Jesus yet, the big take home we can get from this is it's time to take that step. Are there people out in the world right now? Let me ask you, are there people out in the world right now who spiritually constantly have the life bleeding out of them? Are there people out there who are spiritually dead and need to be raised to new life? Are there people out there who spiritually are blind and can't see what they're doing at all? Are there people who are mingled with deep, dark forces, who have taken those things casually and are dealing with supernatural stuff they don't understand? Yes, all those things are true. And every one of those illnesses, though literally they were there and though literally Jesus healed them, all of those also serve as a very powerful metaphor for the spiritual condition that most of the people that you and I know nowadays are in. And some of those people might think, I'm as spiritually healthy as I could get. I have read 3 of Oprah's books, so I'm in really good shape. And that's just not the case, right? You might feel self-assured in the moment, but her word is not life. But Jesus's is. Not to dig on Oprah too much, but you guys get the point. We can look in all different places, but there's only one place that will find salvation. Now, for those who haven't started that process, this is a good reminder to begin it. Go step out, start that relationship with Jesus. Discover the Good Shepherd. Live a life protected by God. Not where you'll never experience pain, but that when hardship comes, he'll be there. He'll walk through it with you. He'll be an ever-present force in your life, guiding you, leading your decisions, refining your character, growing you to spiritually become more and more healthy. That's the journey that we start with God. For those who have already started that journey, though, I want to point out, for almost every single person we talked about in this whole account, there was somebody there. Jairus came for his daughter's sake and begged for her life. And even when he knew she was dead, you can tell. Still, he followed along with Jesus. He brought Jesus there. He took that step of faith, hoping that his daughter would see the fruit of that. The blind men had to stop every 10 feet and ask somebody to help direct them towards where Jesus was. They're in this strange environment, getting pushed around by a crowd. If on a normal day had some sense of where they were walking, they certainly don't today. And yet, they're led there. Other people are willing to give them that push along the way, are willing to have that conversation when people are asking and give the guidance. The man who was demon-possessed, it took somebody dragging him in there. That sounds like some of our teenagers when they come to church on Sunday morning. But they had to be drug in, but they came in and they discovered Jesus in the process. That's your job. You can't make somebody love Jesus. You can't make somebody change their mind, but you can be there to give them direction. You can be there to plead their case. You can try to live in such a way that they can see God in your life, but also be present to have those conversations when the time comes, when they ask for guidance. And that is what Jesus is telling his disciples to do. And next week we'll see him living it out. But that, for us, is what we have to do. We have to live lives that are pointing that same direction, that are leading broken people to Jesus. And in the modern era, we see these miraculous healings really used powerfully to establish the church. And I still think God is powerful enough to do that stuff, but that's not his normal methodology nowadays, I would argue to you. But what is his norm is to take spiritually lost people and bring them to new life. We can pray for ailments, we should. And we can have compassion for those who are dealing with them. We certainly should do that. But more importantly, we don't want people we love, people we know, people in our community to go to hell because we weren't willing to talk to them about Jesus, because it made us a little bit uncomfortable, or it seemed to put us out of our place. I want you to pray this week about how you can be more proactive in doing that. And one way that you can, next week we're going to have invites for Easter, for our Easter service. And it's going to be a really simple thing that you can use to look for a loved one, a friend, a family member, and give them a chance to come to church on Easter. And that'll be a great way to do that. And if you're here today or watching us online and you haven't started that relationship, come and talk to us. Call us, pray with us. We would love to start that journey with you and help you begin to discover the God who created the universe and who is here living among us now. With that, I'll take a moment and I'll call Kent forward. He's going to share our communion and offering meditations. And I think Amy's going to do our music today for closing. As they come forward, I'll ask you to join me in prayer. Father, for many of us, it wasn't very long ago that we were blind, that we were broken and lost. And yet, you put people in our lives, some who just simply gave us direction, some who pled and begged our case, some who even may have drug us unwillingly at times towards you. Lord, thank you for the deliverance you have given us. I pray that you would place a burden on our hearts to bring that deliverance to others. The harvest is still plentiful. Let us be raised up to be workers in it. Thank you, Lord, for all you do. We trust this all to you, and we pray these things in Jesus Christ's name and merit. Amen.